I was gone for a retreat and to work with my teacher in Missouri, Bhante Vimalaramsi, at the Dhamma Sukha Meditation Center. And when you do these retreats, usually if they run around 7 days to 10 days, the first day you always have that question in mind. What did I just sign up for? Too much. Because you're breaking away from society, going into this very austere environment, away from everything that you feel is part of your life. And it's an intentional removal of oneself to place oneself in a space where you discover different aspects of yourself and come across difficult things that you always were able somehow to magically suppress. They show up, which is a wonderful arena for change. So it is, I highly recommend everyone to be able to, if you can find the time to do those retreats, if you can. And it doesn't have to be with one specific tradition. However, in our tradition, in Buddhism, and specifically in Theravada, there now is more opportunities, even in Los Angeles. You don't have to go so far. But it was, Nam was asking me last time to recount some of my experiences, but I will try to weave some of the experiences into today's talk, which is on fatherhood, or the role of fathers. It's interesting, Bhante, how my last talk last month was on motherhood, so Mother's Day. Today it just coincided. I don't know if it was the universe was conspiring to place that opportunity for me to give a talk on fathers this time. Whenever we come or we look into the role of fathers within Buddhism, it gets hazy somehow. We have conflicting perspectives, to say the least. For example, last night before my talk, I'm looking around to see, researching a little bit on this topic, fathers in Buddhism. And some scholars, some individuals who practice even in the path, different paths within Buddhism, let's say Zen or whatever, they have this leaning towards the Siddhartha Gautama, before he became Buddha, that there was this conflict, this tension between himself and his father, King Suddhodana. Historically, from what we find in the records, yes, in the documents that we have, or whatever records we have obtained from those oral traditions first, and then written ones, we see that that is somewhat the case. However, when we look around, ask any male in your family and ask them if they have not had at least one instant in their life where there were no conflicts between themselves and the fathers or father figures they had, or authority figures. So that's a natural phenomena, apparently. However, there's some wonderful gems to be discovered. In my last talk about mothers and Mother's Day, I mentioned something about mothering ourselves, the archetype of a mother, which you can find in, not necessarily in your biological mother per se, but you can find it in many encounters that you have with other human beings even. So similarly, when we look at that, from that angle about, towards, the ideal of fatherhood, we can also see that the archetype of fatherhood is to be found in several entities that roam around in our lives, the people that we come across. Now, coming back to King Suddhodana, Siddhartha, later on became the Buddha, his father, as to how he struggled so much and for so many years, for over 27 years, 28, 29 years, he struggled to keep Siddhartha in the palace, living the princely life, simply because he was told by the seers, by these astrologers of his day, by the rishis or the knowledgeable individuals in his court, that there were two possible roads, outcomes, paths for his child, the prince. Either he could become a Chakravartin, which was a world ruler, because of his extreme level of virtue that he had accumulated for many lifetimes, and his physical strength and his wisdom that they could see based on his physical characteristics, or he could become a world savior, a Buddha. Obviously, as a father, as a king, and the ambitions of a king being inseparable there from how he thought, one would presume, he leaned towards the first one. He wanted his son to become a world conqueror, a world ruler. So if you look at that from that angle, you could see that, it was a very selfish endeavor that he was involved in for 27 years to keep his son being completely enmeshed, drenched in physical, carnal pleasures. He had 3 different palaces for the 3 seasons of India. They don't have 4 seasons there. So he never had a moment where he would just be bored, he thought. He was skilled in so many different arts, martial arts, the classics, reading, writing, etc. All the sciences that were available for a prince to know. So he made all those things available for his father, for his child. I just placed myself in the father's position briefly before I came here today. Could just ambition itself be enough of a propellant, enough of a fuel for a father to keep that ambition alive, to keep that drive to make my son to become a ruler? Would that be just it? Would that just be sufficient of a fuel to completely be so focused on this one possible outcome for his child? And I had to say no. There has to be tremendous love there towards one's child. In fact, not that different from the love of a mother towards a child. And I always see the mother archetype again, and the father similarly, as being the 2 beams that hold up a foyer, hold up a doorway. You can't have one beam holding it up. And today's talk is going to be mostly an exploration of these 2 presences, the mother figure and the father figure in one's life. Many times when people approached the Buddha later on, when he became enlightened, over the 45 years of his teaching, they asked him as to, who are there people in our lives that we can never repay for their work that they've done in our lives, for gratitude? And he said, yes, 2 people. Your parents, your mother and father. You can never repay them, he said. You can repay a Buddha for the Dharma that he gives you, that he gives us, if and when we become enlightened, his children in a sense. That was the way that he would address a person who was fully enlightened, by the way. But he said, you can never repay your mother or father. But there's a caveat, there's a footnote there. He said, however, you can pretty much come close to repaying them with kindness if you make the Dhamma available to them, if you show them the path, show them the Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths, show them what has lit up your own life Which brings us back to this moment in time in our lives. We are here today, we're listening to the Dhamma as a Sangha, sitting there and thinking about how to process all this and the role of our parents, positive or negative, doesn't matter. And I, for one, am taken back to my own parents when they were alive. Unfortunately, I had not come to the Dhamma when my mother was passing, over 25 years ago. However, my father was there, and he passed away last year. I have seen my father I can freely disclose here. My father went through so many changes in his life, as I have gone as well. As a child, as a teenager, and that's when we really, as a male, you really will go through those tensions between the father or father figure and yourself. He was a musician, he was a singer, he was a barber, he was a transporter of valuable goods from the airport to the businesses that were that he was entrusted with carrying gold and jewels and things like that. He placed himself under danger for so many months and years simply to place food on the table. Unfortunately, we lived in Lebanon during the time of the 17-year war, and you would be very happy if you had food on the table that day, just to make sure that we never went to bed hungry. Now, I did get glimpses of that while I was experiencing it, however, never at the extent that I am able to now, or years later. Today, during the last 50 or 70 years, there's been a phenomenon that's been taking place, maybe more than 70 years. And there is, in society, there is almost like a unanimous silence towards it. It's like the elephant in the room that no one wishes to talk about, and that is the role of masculinity that has been severely damaged. And not enough people talk about it or do something about it. Yes, there are oases or islands of individuals who are coming out and really starting a movement towards this return to the sense of masculinity. However, more often than not, they are not well equipped with the knowledge pertaining to what it means to be a masculine figure in one's life. Ever since, whenever there is a war, for example, and all the men or the males are taken off, sent out to war, and many of whom do not return, in their absence, there's a tremendous scarring, tearing up of the family fabric. And that starts with the individual child. Now, in these scenarios, mothers have done incredible jobs of trying to balance both the absence of the father and doing their motherly tasks, which one can just simply try to imagine and never be able to successfully do so. However, no matter how loving, caring, strong-willed, powerful a female, a woman, or a mother is, she can never completely cover for the father. This is not just coming from one person, but this is coming from modern sociologists, psychiatrists, psychologists, anthropologists. We're all looking at society and we're seeing how the masculine figure in today's society has severely been wobbling, lopsided. The psyche of the child has been completely torn up. Look how many people we have, how many fathers or males who have been responsible for some offspring in society have ended up in jails and in prisons. There's a preponderance of fathers in prisons today. Well, what do you think is happening in their households, in the lives of those children? I used to work with some of these children. I used to see them on a daily basis. And they would be completely, once you have gained their trust after a long time. I mentioned one student particularly, this was in 2001 when I met him. It took me over 1.5 years to gain his trust, for him to smile at me, to see me as somebody that he could trust and maybe even care for. He smiled and he said, "Thank you, Mr. B." That's something that we're dealing with on a daily basis. Not everyone has both parents present. Not everyone, even when they do have both parents present, that does not automatically mean that by default they're going to get the full spectrum of a motherly figure and a fatherly figure in one's life. So there's several aspects of an individual as we grow. Now, the role of the father, especially, this is again coming from psychology, field of psychology, as how they have seen and done so many cases, thousands of cases of fathers and their children, specifically their sons. They see that the role of the father is uniquely important for the male child, for the upbringing of the male child, the development and the unification of the psyche of the child, the male child specifically, just like the daughter is uniquely dependent on the motherly figure to take on certain characteristics. See, when we're children, when we're infants even, when we've just been born in the arms of a parent, for example, there are these things called mirror neurons, brain cells, that copy what they see in the outside world. That's why in the 60s, I think in the 50s or 60s, when some Russian scientists did an experiment where a few children who were orphans, I'm presuming, I don't recall the details as such, however, the results, the outcome of the research was that children that were not held, looked at with a kindly smile, with warmth, they died some of them within a few weeks, some of them within a few months. They didn't outlive a year. That gives you some idea as to how it's important for our behavior towards our children growing up. I'm not married, I don't have any children either, and I have been privileged and honored enough to be teaching, and oftentimes I've come across children or even adults in some cases that look upon you with those eyes. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an actual biological father figure there, but just a father figure. Now, I'm going to now take us back to the Sangha, to the Buddha's circle at the time. When later on, when the Buddha became the Buddha, Siddhartha became the Buddha, he went back to his hometown, to his kingdom. And his father had mixed feelings because his son had abandoned him several years earlier. So there was some tension there as well. However, once a parent, you're always a parent, as they say. And so he approached his son with his warmth and kindly and tearful eyes and accepted him back. But he knew that he could not accept him as his son, but he knew, he felt it. However, he was the Buddha, it could be felt apparently. Enough so that he listened to the Dhamma. Now let's go back to what the Buddha said as far as repaying. If we can repay, giving the Dhamma, sharing the Dhamma is it. And he shared the Dhamma with his father. Enough so that he became a first stage enlightened person. He became a Sotapanna. Now, during that time that he visited, his wife at the time, as Siddhartha, whom he left to go on his quest, had already born him a child. At that, the Siddhartha had called him Rahula, which means a fetter or a bond, because that was the thing which was going to hold him back from realizing his goal. So Rahula, is holding his mother's hand, and they're seeing the Buddha along with his disciples. And Princess or Queen Yashodhara, she actually turns to her son Rahula and says, "Go, ask for your inheritance from your father. That's your father." And the child, being 6 or 7 years old, goes to his father and says, "Where is my inheritance?" He was thinking, or she was thinking, of the inheritance of the kingdom, because he still was alive, so therefore he had the entitlement for the crown and all that came with it. The Buddha, without missing a beat, turns to Sariputta, his second in wisdom and second in command, in a sense, and says, "Ordain the kid." He gives him the novice ordination, which was the one that I got, which is the one that you get until you're about 20 years old, and then you are given the full ordination. And that was his inheritance. Now, as Rahula grows up in the Sangha, as a Sangha member, in a sense, he grows up, and there's a sutta called Maharahulovada Sutta, the greater discourse on Rahula, the teaching given to Rahula, his son. And he was about 18 years old, and one day, you can imagine, early in the morning, possibly before, right about the sunrise, the mist is on a hot Indian morning, covering the grounds, and you see these monks walking meditatively. And the Buddha was walking on his alms round, and right behind him was Rahula, his son. You can just imagine how splendid that must have looked like. Now, Rahula, not having been enlightened yet, he has this thought in his mind. Look at this. Look how beautiful this being is in front of me. And he's my father. He's the Buddha. Imagine that. So the qualities that he has, I also, the physical ones that I have too, he's my biological father. He's my father. So as he was having these carnal thoughts, the Buddha read his mind. And he turns to Rahula and says, "Rahula, remember that a being, the physical form, is made out of the 5 aggregates. So every time you think about form, he starts with form, name and form, nama rupa, and he says, understand, contemplate that form ultimately is not mine, is not myself, nor is it who I am." So he went straight into the essence or the crux of what he was thinking of. This is me. So opening his heart of compassion and love, he shared Dhamma with his child, his son, as Siddhartha. And Rahula paused and asked, "Bhante, O Holy One, is this just for form? Should I have this approach of analysis?" And the Buddha says, you should have the same approach of seeing it as not myself, not mine, nor who I am in regards to feeling, in regards to perceptions, in regards to sankharas or fabrications of mind, speech and body, and in regards to consciousness. So all five. He says, thank you, Bhante. Now they were going to get food, alms rounds. He says to himself, wait a minute. The Lord, the Buddha, gave me this specific instructions. I can't just go for food. It's so banal, it's so superficial. Let me go and sit under a tree and let me meditate. As he does so, he's sitting there in meditation. Sariputta later on comes, because Sariputta was such a compassionate father figure in a sense. He never had any children, but he was the father of taking care of the Sangha later on. So he would be the last person to leave the monastery. He would sweep the floors and take care of any sick monks, making sure everything was okay, and then he would leave. He would be the last to leave the monastery to go for alms rounds. So as he was coming out, he saw Rahula sitting and meditating. And Sariputta turns to him and says, without knowing that the Buddha had given him instructions, Sariputta tells him, Rahula, pay attention to your in-breath and out-breath. It is wonderful, the outcomes that it gives. It is wonderful, the realizations that you would get. It's a wonderful practice. Now, Rahula does not say, wait a minute, who are you? The Buddha is my father. He gave me already instructions. He never said that. He bowed and he said, thank you, my teacher. Now imagine if you're Rahula, you're being taught by the Buddha, you're being taught by Sariputta, you're being taught by Moggallana and all the notable greatest monk disciples of the Buddha. And he thought, wait a minute, my father is the king of the Dhamma. And I was just given instructions by the Grand Marshal of the Dhamma, that is Sariputta. And to me, they're such valuable father figures. So anytime we come across an idea or something that's being promoted as far as Buddhism not having the strong ties towards fatherhood, I encourage us to reevaluate such thoughts or such perspectives. Because again, when the Buddha was asked as to who should one look up to, because Sariputta was second in wisdom, again, to the Buddha, and there was a question of some people coming and asking, who should we look up to? Because you need to have an ideal, a person that you emulate. We need to emulate someone in our lives, both while we're mothering ourselves and as well as for the fathering of ourselves. We need to have these individuals in our lives. It could be a character even from a book. It does not have to be a physical presence or even biological at some point. And the Buddha's answer to this was, if the person is a monk, then he needs to look up to Sariputta or Moggallana. However, it is not wise for a layperson to look up to Sariputta as one's ideal, because inevitably you're going to end up being a monk. So who should a layperson, upasaka, a male look up to? And the Buddha said, Chitta. Chitta was the name of one of the Buddha's disciples, who was a householder, who was a layperson, who was married, who had many children, and who was an incredibly rich, wealthy benefactor of the Sangha, but who had also attained anagami, the third stage, enlightened. So he was just like on the fence of becoming an arahant. And he was an extremely, extremely wise disciple of the Buddha. Now, having talked about the Buddhist angle, the Buddhist aspect of, okay, we have some time a little bit more. So we can go into the social aspects of things a little bit more. The ability to live one's life in a wholesome way inevitably will have us come across some really tough situations in life, unless we're living under a rock or something, and we're never having a good experience of life, not growing in a sense. The ability to uproot oneself courageously. When you find yourself in a position that you're just struggling to make it, struggling and fighting against your own innate qualities that are screaming at you for them to evolve, screaming at you for not missing any more opportunities. Now, these could even be ambitions. These could be wanting to go and make a fortune for yourself, or having a family, or going and pursuing a relationship, or wanting to go and pursue an education. Yet, somehow being in this perpetual state of procrastination. You need some force that grabs you from your roots and pulls you out and jump into the unknown. If we think about, let's pick out the subject of relationships. Let's say a person who has been extremely hurt, burnt in a relationship, fallen in love, they were betrayed, etc., which happens every day. The typical response to this would be, you know what, I don't want to have anything to do with new relationships. I'm done. And I see this every day. We see this every day. Once the healing is done, once we accept the pain is there, not suppressing it, we see the value of beneficial depression, for example. And that's a quality that the presence of a father in one's life, a healthy presence of a father figure in one's life, could allow us to discover more and become more connected with that aspect of ourselves that gives us the courage to pull ourselves from those roots and trust courageously in the possibilities that are awaiting for us, whether it's a new relationship, whether it's going into a different course. Some people have been studying, let's say, to become a lawyer, an attorney, and then they say, I have one person that I've met who, the last semester of his program, he just said, you know what, this is not for me, and he quit. He has over $120,000 in debt. He's almost done. The toughest part of studying to become an attorney is the first year, they all say. He quit. He's like, no, I'm going to be a chef. That takes tremendous courage. The ability to have intimacy, for example. One cannot overemphasize or overestimate the value of the human touch. And this is where the role of a father is extremely important in one's life as we're growing up, as infants. So much of us have intimacy issues these days. You have on one extreme the masochistic type of a masculine, which is not what masculinity is all about. It's about balance. And on the other, you have the extremely, worlds apart from what a male figure stands for. That the opposite sex, for example, is always looking for, if, you're heterosexual, for example. But you have the same roles present in all kinds of sexual orientations, because we cannot remove the motherly characteristic and fatherly characteristic, irrespective of the orientation. We are seeking that union within ourselves, and that's what we look for in the opposite person. And I take notes again, I never look at them, I forget. So the intimacy is extremely important, but that intimacy cannot take place unless we have become able to become intimate with ourselves. For example, in Tibetan Buddhism, there is in Tantric Buddhism, there's the role of the tigle, or the seeds, or the drops, they call them. In Tibetan Buddhism, they believe that a person gets the white seed from the mother, I believe it's from the mother, and the red seed from the father. And those two meet in the embryo. That turns into the heart. And then once the person is grown, they separate. One goes into the center of the brain, the other one goes into the reproductive organs throughout one's life. Now, when we approach death, those two energies, the bija or the tigle, they come together. They meet back into the heart. So as we start, so we end. However, there needs to be that balance. So that's what I encourage us to think about when we think of the role of a father, when we think about the role of a mother in one's life. They are inseparably important in the evolution of our psyche, our mind, our practice, in our lives. Are we good with? Oh, yeah. A few questions, if there are any. No? No questions? Yes?
One of the questions about when he mentioned meditation and he did tell me about breathing.
Yes.
Can you explain yourself? How do you get in there? Because I don't know yet and I'm trying to get that knowledge as far as I can
of course.
Be better.
A good question, because many of us, especially in the West, have been taught so much about meditation being synonymous with the breath meditation, as if the Buddha never taught anything else. In fact, the breath meditation is mentioned about maybe 8 times at the most throughout the whole Nikayas. And there are other techniques. He talked about at least 40 different techniques. And metta practice, for example, is mentioned many more times. Loving kindness. However, because your question is in regards to breath, I will try to answer that as briefly as possible, and possibly even use today's theme of fatherhood in connection to that. Unfortunately, when we are being taught, or whatever is being taught unanimously, or in general terms, when they talk about breath meditation, it's mostly single, one-pointed meditation. One-pointed meditation was already in practice at the time of Siddhartha and the Buddha. And in fact, it was the technique that he used for over 6 years. So this is what a lot of teachers are not able to explain as to if it's single-pointed meditation, which is very focused. Just focus on the breath. Just focus on the breath, and sometimes you can spend a whole lifetime doing it and without any realization. The goal of the Buddhist bhavana, or mental cultivation practice, Buddhist practice, that sets it apart from other traditions, is the ability of one, through the practice of mental cultivation, to get to wisdom. That is the goal, which is inevitably going to allow a person to cut the cord to samsara, to come back again and again. Let's not confuse that. That is the goal, no matter what tradition you belong to. Now, there has to be the ability to have the softer edge to it. Meaning, yes, you are sitting. Yes, you are focused on the breath. Yes, you are allowing the breath to be observed constantly. However, it's inevitable for us when we're meditating to become tight in our brain. Part of the brain gets tensed up. It's unavoidable. Now, if I can, let's say, use the analogy of that being a masculine characteristic of holding on, being tough, and being strong, and persevering through an hour or a week or 8 months of meditation at a retreat, then the motherly figure has to come in and relax that. Softer touches introduced. So you notice, you recognize the tightness in the brain. You notice also the tightness in different parts of the body. Your jaw. If you've ever seen people meditating, they're always stern. You see these lines on their forehead. That's not meditation. That's concentration. You will not gain wisdom from that. I say this because I've done breath meditation exclusively for 20 years. And you see that in the Nikayas. There has to be that introduction of the softer touch. So we recognize that there is a tightness in the mind. And then we release that tightness. And then we relax the body. Make it fun. So I introduce a smile. Be softer. Motherly, kind, warm smile. It's okay. I have tightness in the mind again. So what? And then you return back to your object of meditation, which in this example is the breath. And then you repeat the whole thing. However, some people have asked me, how many times do I need to do this? Well, as many times as it takes. That's where your motherly role of forgiveness has to come in. You forgive yourself for being distracted. You forgive yourself for being so tightly holding on to the object. So what? We've spent eons of lifetimes being so far away from wisdom and being drenched in ignorance. In one sitting, it's not all going to go away. It's okay. Meditation is supposed to be fun, and that is the mother and the father in your practice working together. That's a happy family. So have fun with it, play with it. Be softer, but keep that observation going of the breath. Softly. So that would be my way of, it's just one way of describing or explaining it.